Welcome to Defender Fridays, everyone. Glad to see a decent number of folks made it, even though I know we're kind of coming into the holiday season, which means things are hopefully slowing down for most, maybe picking up for others. But either way, thank you all for making the time to join us today. We've got a pretty awesome guest today because I think it's somebody that most of you, if not all of you, are familiar with. Maxime Lamothe-Brassard is joining us. As many of you know, he's the founder, the CEO behind LimaCharlie, which is who brings us Defender Fridays and makes this possible. But I don't think as many people know, Max, how interesting your background is, and how relevant it is to the topic that you wanted to chat about today, which is malware reverse engineering and its applicability in security operations. So I don't think you really need much more introduction than that, Max, but let's dive into your thoughts.
Awesome. Sounds good. Yeah, like I was trying to think about a topic and, I'll go like super briefly in my background, but like the TLDR is I used to do a lot of stuff and a lot of like reverse engineering, but it's been a while. And I was kind of like thinking about that and thinking about like the approach that, you used to take and all that. And then I got like the silly, well, not silly, but like obvious question, which is like, is that still how it's being done? Is that still how people think about it? And I was genuinely curious about it. And so I was like, okay, that's a perfect topic to chat about here. Um, so my background, like super quickly, I started doing security out of university. That's the only thing like I've done. And I joined out of university an organization called CSE in Canada, the Communication Security Establishment. It's like the NSA in Canada. I'm Canadian, and so
Yes.
I, on this
NSA.
the
Sorry.
NSA, right?
Sorry. Bad.
um, yeah. So I was on like the second side of the house for a while, doing a bunch of different things. Started as a developer, building like tech in C, and then eventually got a little bit more into the ops side of things. And then that brought me into the counter CNE kind of greenfield. At the time was like just pure greenfield. So counter CNE was essentially the idea of so CNE, computer network exploitation, and looking at that's my definition. I haven't looked up the definition, but like actively, semi-actively looking for the bad guys in high value places. And so it was kind of different from the pure intelligence side of things that was more about like just tracking globally and way more passively things. So we were very involved into like finding and tracking the bad guys. And the context is super important here. I really want to call that up because I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but I would be shocked if this was like the standard. But the idea was we were looking for bad guys in really high value networks. And because we were doing this for the government, it meant that it wasn't about like, hey, here's some, at the time ransomware was barely a thing. And so it wasn't about like, hey, there's this random ransomware or this random thing on the network. Like if it wasn't a state, like, we didn't really care about that. So that skewed a lot how we did and why we did reverse engineering, I think. It kind of meant that that we did reverse engineering where if you needed to spend a bunch of time doing reverse engineering, it was really worth it. Yeah. Whereas like, if you're just tracking strain number 545 of this random malware that, is just like spamming email, you're going to spend like a month reversing that thing. It's probably not worth it.
To what outcome, right?
Exactly. And yeah, so it was huge greenfield approach. Like at the time, we were really at the very beginning of that stuff. So within that context, my experience at the time was that we took a really kind of aggressively simple approach and ramped it up as needed. And I think sometimes people would get lost in like the fun of doing reverse engineering. And so, you get some malware and like you pop in an IDA right away. Or what is it nowadays? It's the NSA one they released.
Oh yeah, shoot.
I should know this.
I know exactly which one you're talking about.
Dragon something? Or no, Hydra. Hydra.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Hydra. Yeah.
Yeah. I never actually used it. It was before that. So like, going with strings was like the fastest possible ROI that you could have, right? Where you just got like a rough idea. Obviously, you didn't get you very far, right? So, but the kind of the core tenet there was the best RE is no RE, because you can spend so much time on it that if you don't need it, if you can just dump the strings from memory and get, the key that they encrypt their zip files with, that way is just way better than doing anything else.
And I think Max, that being a pretty legacy approach actually still holds a lot of truth today, right? Like sometimes it's the simplest thing that'll get you the answer that you need, right? The Pareto principle, right? What's the smallest amount of effort I can put in to get the largest, kind of reward, because once you get into that final 20% that you're trying to figure out, now the cost is exponential. But one way that this method's evolved, like strings, is like some of the more forensic focused strings utilities. Like I dropped one from Mandiant called the Floss utility. It's just strings, but they built some intelligence into it to do like more kind of post analysis, of raising the interesting stuff. But I mean, strings is still alive and well today.
Nice. Yeah, and like even Notepad sometimes was pretty useful because you could just, stuff just pop right up. Not the most advanced thing. I feel bad even admitting to do that. So strings was super good. I think the next level, like the next kind of thing that was useful was spending a lot of time looking at looking at hex dumps, and it's kind of like your eyes narrow after a while. But the thing was having the ability to just get used to recognizing stuff that through a hex dump, and just recognizing like high entropy. You would usually be able to go through it, and the general order of like the segments within a PE, and you could get to that point where it's not that it's precise, right? It's not that exactly what's going on, but you can just visually really quickly get a feel for like, hey, there's this big high entropy blob that is right in the resources. Okay, there's probably some kind of encrypted resource. So maybe I don't need to actually reverse the whole thing. Maybe I can just skip all of that stuff and just set a breakpoint on memory access to that resource. So I think that was a really valuable process, but at the same time, like, I don't know if it maps so well if you were in a different context. Like, is it worth the time?
I've got thoughts for sure. And then I'd love to hear the thoughts of some of the others out there that are doing the job. So RE, Max, your intuition is still, I think, valid today, because RE is one of those things where the cost is very high, but the potential for intelligence development is equally high. But the question I think that a lot of folks don't properly answer is, to what degree can we afford that cost, and how well can we operationalize the output, right? It's like, so Sure, great. We got a malware sample that was sent in a spearfish email to a couple of folks in our company, right? Like, should we RE it? Some orgs are like, yeah, we RE all malware. Okay, that's not the right answer. Like that's just not efficient, right? You're gonna waste a lot of time with no real ROI. But like, okay, but what if it's a non-commodity piece of malware? There's no hash for it on virus total, nothing OSINT of, comes back that, this thing is seen anywhere else. Okay, well now maybe we're considering something that's being targeted, right, to our organization. Okay, now that takes it like up one rung on the ladder, right? Like to say it could be worthwhile maybe to do some deeper analysis of it. But like still, I think you have to kind of go through the loop of what is our end goal? Because before we just sink some time into this, like we should have sort of like, it's like a project. We should have some deliverables. Like what's the output? What's the outcome? Like, do we even have the skill set to do this? Because a person that does not RE every day, like for instance, I'm not a professional RE person. I've analyzed a lot of binaries, but I'm not an RE. Like it's going to take me a lot longer than like someone like you who, writes in C, to break down and really properly RE this thing. And so weighing these things I think is important because in most situations, I would say the overwhelming majority of situations, RE is not the right answer. Right now, are there ways to kind of meet in the middle on that though? Yes. Right. Like, quick static analysis tools like, yeah, sure. Strings. I dropped another one in the chat. Anybody hasn't heard of a tool called PE scan? Like these are tools that will basically do a whole ton of really quick analysis without you needing to be an RE wizard, right? Kepa is a tool from Mandiant that'll basically do some pretty decent analysis of a binary to output like, here's what this thing is capable of. And it's just doing it in a way similar to like a Yaris scan. It's just looking for patterns of certain function names or kernel calls or whatever to say, hey, this thing's capable of evading sandboxes and doing whatever. So like, I still think there are sort of stair steps you can take to say, okay, we'll do a quick triage, but we're not going to open this thing up in a hex editor and spend 6 weeks on it unless we have really good reason to. It's kind of my thought process. And then of course, I know somebody just dropped it into chat. Sandboxes, like Max, I don't know, did you guys have much in the way of like sandboxing like we have today back when you guys were coming up? And yeah, because it's greenfield, right? Well, today, right, the ability to sandbox something takes so much of the guesswork out of the picture. But of course, being mindful of OPSEC and controlling the sample and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I suspect that there's also maybe an interesting in between, even between it. So I think there's value in like not doing RE. There's value in doing the RE. In that middle, there's like the detonation, right? Like the sandboxes where you can get a bunch of stuff. But I'm curious if there's good frameworks or even just like processes around saying, hey, it's not that I can't put this in a sandbox and get data out. It's that this looks weird enough that I'm going to get stuff from that sandbox, but I'm probably missing something. And like this, you should RE this or you should not, kind of thing. Because I think that's where, like for us back then, that was really where we would often hit that decision point of doing the RE. Like, what you got in a sandbox, like I would have loved to have sandboxes, but you can usually do that, like, so you've got an isolated VM and, you run it and you kind of do like very basic SRE, like on it, you eventually get to that result. But that last step, which is the full RE over the binary, and even that, I think there's a half step there, which is when you get to the point where you say, okay, I'm going to have this in Ghidra or IDA Pro, you can do one of two approaches. You can do the full bottom up or top down approach, which is, I think is the fun one, where, you start to kind of label the whole execution tree and the functions and, like looking at the functions, how they're being called, what they're doing, and that feeling of like discovering, oh, this thing is called everywhere, and oh, this is the, it's the, I don't know, it's the routine that does a CRC on part of their code to see if it's been modified. Like that fun is just like, that's the best part of it. But I think there's also the half step where you say, look, I know what I care about. And right now, what I care about is getting a network signature for how they talk to their C2. And I'm just going to focus on the code that very directly goes into, I don't know, the Windows API to like do network connections. And then like doing just that part of the RE, which is more like I think the realistic or the reasonable part of that.
Something just popped into my head. I don't know why I didn't think about this a minute ago, and it's an older story for me, but I can think of one situation as an IR worked many years ago where RE actually saved the day. Found malware sitting on a domain controller, had been there for years. Like that was the mind-blowing part, is how long it had been there before an incident occurred, which brought it to light. And so the customer's thinking, okay, so burn it all down, right? Like it's on the domain controller, we're hosed. And it was actually RE that actually lowered the temperature a little bit for this case, because when we took that whole payload apart, what we found was it was kind of in the category of info stealers, but it was actually only looking for credit card data and memory. So it was something that was looking for payment processing systems or anything where credit card information was being exchanged. That's all it did. All it did was basically run regex patterns over memory, looking for that data, and then, collecting it up to send it. Well, I mean, it's still bad news for the organization, right? Yeah, malware made it on the DC. Yeah, you've got a lot of problems that need fixing. But as far as like what the true impact of this is, it was actually pretty minimal. And we only knew that because we took apart the sample and understood kind of what it was able to do. But again, the time it took to do that was non-trivial, right? So it's just, having a goal in mind. But in the case of IR, where the thing did blow up, sometimes it's important to know to what degree that thing blew up, what capabilities of a malware sample had. But somebody raised a good question in chat, and I don't want it to get lost in there. So talking about like, yeah, we've got all these fancy tools like, Joe Sandbox or AnyRun or whatever, and VirusTotal, where, okay, like I don't really need to RE anything. I'll just blast it up to this site. But the point that was made in chat is one I think everybody needs to be familiar with, is be mindful that when you send these samples out, right, you are giving up control of that sample. You're giving up any advantage that you have as a defender, that you're looking at this payload, right? If I send a sample to VirusTotal, anybody now can see that sample's been submitted, including the adversary that crafted it, right? And so be mindful of tipping your hand, because the moment that sample gets submitted, and the adversary knows it's been submitted, right, they're going to switch tactics, and they might become more aggressive, knowing that, oh, you're on to them, and they're going to start moving faster. And so, having internal processes that don't rely on, an external service that can be watched by others might make sense for some teams.
For sure. And I think the other part of that is you don't know what you don't know. And sometimes it makes sense, right? Like although I don't use them like day to day anymore, but like that a detonation service, put it like generally like a sandbox, would be able to tell you things about well-known common things. But where, like in my experience, where RE ended up being really useful were in the cases where something just came out of left field completely, like you had no idea. And so like there's two cases for me that came that way, that were about things that I had no idea. So in one case, it was, like reversing some, pardon my French, some shitty dropper. And just like, hey, this thing, goes into like a start menu kind of thing. I don't know if it actually did, but it was really at that level. And looking through it, opening it up in, I think in IDA Pro, and going through the memory, seeing a block of memory that had strings that in and of themselves, like, probably, I wouldn't have known to search for that. And I wouldn't expect a detonation service to actually flag that as like, holy shit, holy shit, holy shit. Right. But when you go through that and it was like, Siemens hardware, like specs, and you're like, I did not, I never expected that. I never knew that I was looking for that, but just seeing that told me that I have to like go all the way. The other big one was seeing some really weird executable code within a different dropper, and seeing that the code structure itself was built for a totally different environment, and then doing a bunch of Googling based on that, just trying to understand, this is Windows API code, but it's like it's not normal. It's not just using like the file open API, and figuring out that this was actually meant to be part of a BIOS image that would execute. And it's like, I would not expect any sandbox to actually be able to automatically go like, hey, holy shit, holy shit, holy shit, this is something about a BIOS. But the first time you see it, and just having gone through the steps of it, and you go like, oh, now that's worth it,
Hey, there's somebody on this call. I'd love to hear their thoughts. So sorry to put you on the spot, but Andrew Cook, you got a ton of ops experience on the threat hunt IR side of things, both in the military and then private sector. What are your thoughts around the role of reverse engineering in today's like modern security operations capability?
Yeah, I've always sort of thought about, there's like, it's almost like picking fast and slow, right? So like during an incident, a lot of the times you want fast, accurate, actionable answers, and and reverse engineering, about the most you're probably going to do is like the sandbox kind of work, right? Because you're dealing with like what data, you're probably dealing with like the data you already have, like it set off certain sensors, and you just got to find the IP address. You're just looking for certain, what is the next most important question to move the incident forward? How do I know that this malware ran on the system? Okay, the IP address. You know what I mean? Like, how much reverse engineering did you have to do for that? So tactical reverse engineering during an incident, if you're at that point where you needed to be retroactively looking at a piece of malware, you're probably in a tough spot, right? Strategically, though, sort of in the thinking slow, like the longer term thing, I think we got to super appreciate the folks that have the wherewithal to, after the incident or when an interesting piece of malware comes up, to do the reverse engineering, so that we're like, that's where those reports are much more useful to me, I think, is right. Like, not every organization can have and need reverse engineering within their sort of SecOps incident response piece in any like super mature way. But there are organizations that every piece of malware is going to get pulled apart by a human, and then the reports that go out to the antivirus vendors and the big reports, and hey, it actually turns out they're exploiting a vulnerability, or this is a nifty trick. That's all a lot of stuff that's not useful really during an incident, right? But it's going to be right? It's going to be more interesting. So that's the two roles. I've always been in the fast zip line way, where I got to do some fast and dirty reverse engineering. And if I'm at that point, it's like, oh man, this is already too slow. But the big thinking still needs to happen, and it's not necessarily during the incident, right? Yeah.
So like the way that kind of boils down in my mind, and this is good news, I think, for defenders, is, Max, your perspective comes from being in the building with no windows, state sponsored stuff, right? Where Intel is the most valuable product for your business, if you want to call it that. Like, but to Andrew's point, for folks doing the day in, day out, you're in the trenches of the SOC, you're either doing, working the alert backlog, or maybe doing some degree of IR. Most often, the thing you need in that moment are actually the quickest answers that don't take a sophisticated approach to RE, but the quicker hits, right? Like, hit it, in a sandbox, hit it with a quick YARA scan, run a PE scan or floss or something against it. We'll get the IPs, we'll get the indicators, the registry key, whatever. Like those are usually the quicker hits to get. Now, is that going to be like the comprehensive thing that turns into the next, viral threat intel blog post? No, but it's enough to help you scope and contain your incident. But to Andrew's point, the folks that really do take that stuff apart at the level that Max, you guys were doing back at the NSA, sorry, I'm going to hold on to that one. Like that's well, at least on the private sector side, those are the kind of intel reports that I think are most actionable to defenders for the proactive side of things, right? We consume those, we learn more about these malware families and samples, and it better informs, I think, how we structure our defenses, right? How we craft new detection rules and things like that. And so, yeah, that's I think that's a really cool way of kind of thinking about it. And again, I think it's good news to defenders that not everybody on the team needs to be an RE expert.
For sure. And the other part, which like we talked about the sandboxes, but my understanding is there's a bunch of companies that are working on some really advanced automated kind of forms of reverse engineering. It's kind of like, it's probably in parallel to sandboxing, which is more around the profiling, right, of the running malware. But I think they're doing a lot of just deep analysis and automated analysis of, the call trees and comparing that to other types of malware and being able to auto label like, hey, this is an AES, 256 encryption routine, like do all of that stuff. So I think, and I'm going to mention the AI word, but like, I think all of those things together are also going to probably lower the bar in terms of who's able to get access to a lot of those capabilities that historically, to Andrew's point, like, if it takes you a week, like you're not going to do that during an IR, but maybe they get it to the point where it's like, you can put it and an hour later, you get something that changes that relationship to, I bet.
And your perspective coming from the NSA, the other piece that we take for granted, like the people working it on the thing have one piece of malware, right? Where reverse engineering is a lot more, again, sort of strategically valuable on the defensive side, is that one layer up of who's watching the whole campaign, who's linking this malware is related to this malware, and it's this threat group. And so that's when you get like, when I'm thinking about the Texas ransomware incident, I was a boot on the ground for a city, but the FBI and the NOC was up there doing all, and the Emergency Operations Center was up there doing all the aggregation of that story. So my little piece of malware was like, okay, cool. How do I know if it's on my network? But those were the guys that looked across 47 of those and said, hey, these are linked. This was the beta version. This was before they changed the thing, right? Like it makes sense at that, like that strategic level to have really deep reverse engineering, anyway.
Yeah. So basically having facilities to produce, consume, and manage threat intelligence, right? Like
right.
If you aren't really operationalizing threat intelligence, then RE is going to have limited value to, in my opinion,
to an individual organization trying to work a case, right? It's the collected. So you get diffusion cells and centers and NSA and nation state level things that, anyway.
I dig it. All right, folks, good times. Time flies. You're having fun. Max, thank you so much for coming on and just getting our minds going, thinking about this topic. I don't think we've covered this one at all ever on any of these shows. So it's kind of new territory for us. So I'm glad you came up with that topic. So everybody else, thank you so much for joining us. If you're not already in the LimaCharlie public Slack, join us. Not only do good conversations happen there throughout the week, but also that's where you can get one of the shirts that Max is actually wearing right now. We give away a free one every week. I think you folks know that by now, but you got to be in Slack to know if you want. So slack.limacharlie.io. And for everyone else, have a great rest of your Friday, and we'll see you same time, same place next week. Take care, everyone.